Marcus stood at the edge of the training ground, watching as the other recruits practiced their drills. Their laughter echoed across the dusty field as they took turns shooting at targets. Every arrow they released seemed to find its mark with ease, while Marcus clutched his worn bow with trembling hands. "Look at the village boy trying to play soldier," sneered Thomas, the captain's son. His perfectly polished armor gleamed in the afternoon sun as he stepped closer to Marcus. "Maybe you should go back to milking cows where you belong." The other recruits burst into laughter. Marcus felt his face burn with shame, but he kept his eyes fixed on the distant targets. He had traveled 3 days from his small village just for the chance to join the Royal Guard. His family had saved every copper coin they could find to buy him basic equipment and send him to the capital. "I'm here to serve the kingdom," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible over the mocking voices around him. "Serve the kingdom?" Thomas laughed louder. "You can barely hold that pathetic bow straight. The Royal Guard needs real warriors, not farm boys who smell like pig slop." Commander Harrison watched from his position near the armory. He was a tall, stern man with gray hair and countless battle scars. His cold eyes observed every interaction among the recruits, but he never intervened in their conflicts. He believed that only the strongest would survive the training, and weak spirits had no place in the Royal Guard. "Show us what you can do then, village boy," called out Elena, a skilled archer from a noble family. She gestured toward the targets with mock encouragement. "Prove you deserve to be here with the rest of us." Marcus walked toward the shooting line, feeling dozens of eyes watching his every move. His hands shook as he notched an arrow to his bowstring. The target seemed impossibly far away, and the weight of everyone's expectations pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy stone. He drew the bow back, trying to remember everything his grandfather had taught him during those long afternoons in the forest behind their cottage. But the jeering voices around him made it impossible to concentrate. His arrow flew wide, missing the target completely and disappearing into the grass beyond. The laughter that followed was deafening. Some recruits doubled over with amusement, while others pointed and whispered to their friends. Marcus felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment as he lowered his bow. "I told you," Thomas announced loudly. "This peasant has no business being here. He's wasting everyone's time and making us all look bad." "Maybe we should help him find his way back to the pig farm," suggested another recruit, a burly young man named Victor, who came from a family of renowned knights. Marcus wanted to disappear into the ground. He had dreamed of this moment for years, imagining himself standing proudly among the elite soldiers who protected the royal family. Instead, he found himself surrounded by people who saw him as nothing more than entertainment. Commander Harrison finally spoke, his voice cutting through the laughter like a blade. "Enough. Williams, you have one more chance to hit the target. If you fail, you'll be dismissed from training and sent home on the next wagon." The training ground fell silent. Marcus felt every pair of eyes boring into him as he selected another arrow from his quiver. This was it, his last opportunity to prove that he belonged here. If he failed now, he would have to return to his village in shame, knowing that he had let down everyone who believed in him. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the whispers and stares. In his mind, he could hear his grandfather's gentle voice teaching him about patience and focus. "The bow is just a tool, Marcus," the old man had said. "The real weapon is your mind. When you find peace within yourself, the arrow will find its mark." Marcus opened his eyes and raised his bow again. This time, he ignored the crowd completely. He focused only on the target, feeling the rough wood of his bow and the familiar weight of the arrow. He drew the string back slowly, steadying his breathing as his grandfather had taught him. The arrow flew straight and true, striking the outer ring of the target with a solid thud. It wasn't a perfect shot, but it was enough to keep him in training. The other recruits fell silent, their expressions ranging from surprise to disappointment. "Acceptable," Commander Harrison said with no emotion in his voice. "Williams, you'll continue training with the others. Everyone else back to your drills." As the crowd dispersed, Marcus retrieved his arrow from the target. His hands were still shaking, but now it was from relief rather than fear. He had survived his first real test, but he knew this was only the beginning. The other recruits still saw him as an outsider, and he would have to work twice as hard as anyone else to earn their respect. Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into training with desperate determination. While the other recruits slept, he practiced his archery by moonlight. When they gathered for meals and conversation, he studied military tactics and weapon maintenance. Every spare moment was devoted to improving his skills and proving that he deserved his place among them. But no matter how hard he worked, the mockery never stopped. The other recruits found new ways to humiliate him every day. They would hide his equipment, put salt in his water, and spread rumors about his background. Thomas seemed to take particular pleasure in making Marcus's life miserable, often tripping him during drills or accidentally knocking his food to the ground during meals. "You know you don't belong here," Thomas whispered to Marcus one evening as they cleaned their weapons. "No matter how much you practice, you'll never be one of us. You're just a temporary amusement until the commander realizes his mistake." Marcus said nothing, but inside his heart, doubt began to grow. Maybe Thomas was right. Maybe he was fooling himself by thinking he could become a member of the Royal Guard. The other recruits came from families with long military traditions. They had been training for this their entire lives, while he had spent his childhood helping his father tend crops and repair farm equipment. The physical training was brutal, but the emotional isolation was worse. Marcus ate his meals alone, slept in a corner bunk that the others avoided, and endured constant reminders that he didn't fit in. Every night, he would lie awake wondering if he should just give up and return home before he embarrassed himself further. But something deep inside him refused to quit. Perhaps it was pride, or perhaps it was the memory of his grandfather's encouraging words. The old man had been a soldier once, long ago, and he had filled Marcus's childhood with stories of honor, duty, and courage. Those stories had planted a seed in Marcus's heart that grew stronger with each passing day of training. "The greatest warriors are not born," his grandfather had once told him. "They are forged by adversity and shaped by determination. Anyone can swing a sword when they feel strong and confident. But only true soldiers can find strength when everything seems hopeless." Marcus held on to those words as he endured week after week of grueling training and constant humiliation. He watched as weaker recruits were dismissed and sent home, while he somehow managed to survive each test and challenge that Commander Harrison placed before them. His skills slowly improved, though he remained at the bottom of every ranking and evaluation. The archery training was particularly difficult for Marcus. While the other recruits could group their arrows tightly together in the center of targets, Marcus struggled to hit the target at all on some days. His inconsistency frustrated Commander Harrison, who would often use Marcus as an example of what not to do during demonstrations. "Williams represents everything that is wrong with lowering our standards," the commander announced during one particularly harsh evaluation. "He lacks the natural ability, the proper training, and the aristocratic bearing that we expect from the Royal Guard. Yet he continues to waste our time and resources with his presence." The words stung worse than any physical blow, but Marcus absorbed them silently. He had learned that defending himself only made things worse, and that the best response to criticism was to work even harder. That night, he practiced his archery until his fingers bled and his arms ached beyond endurance. As the months passed, Marcus began to notice subtle changes in his abilities. His arrows flew straighter and hit their targets more consistently. His sword work became more fluid and precise. His endurance improved until he could complete the longest marches without falling behind. But these improvements seemed to go unnoticed by everyone except Marcus himself. The other recruits continued to treat him as a joke, and Commander Harrison remained coldly disapproving of his progress. Marcus sometimes wondered if he was imagining his improvement, or if the standards for the Royal Guard were simply beyond his reach. The doubt gnawed at him constantly, threatening to destroy the fragile confidence he had worked so hard to build. Then came the day that would change everything. It started like any other morning, with the recruits gathering for their usual training exercises. But as they assembled on the field, a messenger arrived with urgent news that would test every skill they had learned and reveal the true character that lay hidden beneath their polished exteriors. The messenger's horse was covered in sweat and dust, its sides heaving from a hard ride. The young soldier slid from his saddle and approached Commander Harrison with obvious urgency. His uniform bore the insignia of the Border Patrol, and his face was grim with serious news. "Commander," the messenger said, saluting quickly, "bandits have attacked the Royal Hunting Lodge in the northern forest. They've taken several nobles hostage, including Lord Blackwood's daughter. The king demands immediate action." A murmur of excitement ran through the assembled recruits. This was their first chance to participate in a real mission, not just training exercises. Marcus felt his heart pound with a mixture of fear and anticipation. After months of being treated as the weakest link, he might finally have an opportunity to prove himself in actual combat. Commander Harrison studied the messenger's report with his usual stern expression. "How many bandits? What are their positions and defenses?" "Unknown, sir," the messenger replied. "The attack happened at dawn. A few servants escaped and brought word to the nearest garrison, but we have no detailed intelligence about the enemy numbers or capabilities." "Perfect," Thomas muttered to his friends. "Our first real mission, and we're going in blind. This is exactly the kind of situation that separates real soldiers from pretenders." Marcus ignored the pointed comment, but he felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. The other recruits had years of advanced training and came from families with military traditions. They understood tactics and strategy in ways that Marcus was still struggling to learn. What if his inexperience put the entire mission in danger? Commander Harrison made his decision quickly. "We'll take 20 recruits on this mission. The rest will remain here to continue training." He began calling out names, selecting the most skilled and experienced candidates. Marcus listened hopefully, but his name was not among those chosen. His heart sank as he realized he would be left behind once again. While the others rode off to their first taste of real combat, he would remain at the training camp like a child deemed too weak for adult responsibilities. The disappointment was crushing, but it was nothing new. He had grown accustomed to being overlooked and underestimated. "Williams!" Commander Harrison called out just as Marcus was turning to leave. "You'll come as well. We need someone to tend the horses and maintain equipment." Marcus felt a surge of excitement, even though he understood this was not exactly a combat role. At least he would be part of the mission, even if only as support staff. The other recruits looked surprised and somewhat annoyed that the weakest among them had been included, but they said nothing in the commander's presence. Within an hour, the selected recruits were mounted and riding north toward the forest, where the Royal Hunting Lodge was located. Marcus rode at the back of the column, leading 2 pack horses loaded with supplies and extra equipment. He tried to ignore the whispered conversations ahead of him, where the other recruits discussed tactics and speculated about the coming battle. "I bet it's just a small group of desperate thieves," Victor said confidently. "A few sword swings and they'll surrender or run away. This will be easier than our training exercises." "Don't underestimate them," Elena warned. "Desperate men are often more dangerous than trained soldiers. They have nothing to lose, which makes them unpredictable." Thomas rode near the front of the column, close to Commander Harrison. "Sir, what exactly is William supposed to do during the actual fighting?" We can't have him getting in the way when things get serious. Williams will remain with the horses as planned, the commander replied without looking back. His job is to ensure our equipment and mounts are secure, not to engage in combat. Marcus felt his face burn with shame. Even when he was included in important missions, he was relegated to the sidelines like a servant or camp follower. Part of him understood the logic. He was the least experienced fighter among them, and keeping him away from combat reduced the risk to everyone else. But it still hurt to be treated as dead weight. The northern forest was thick and ancient, with towering trees that blocked most of the sunlight and created an atmosphere of perpetual twilight. The hunting lodge was located deep within these woods, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound between massive oak and pine trees. It was the perfect location for an ambush, which explained why the bandits had chosen it for their attack. As they approached the lodge, Commander Harrison called a halt and gathered his recruits around him. Through the trees ahead, they could see smoke rising from the lodge's chimney, indicating that someone was definitely inside. The building itself was a large, comfortable structure built from local stone and timber, designed to accommodate hunting parties for weeks at a time. "We need intelligence before we can plan our assault," the commander said quietly. "Elena, take 2 men and circle around to observe the rear of the building. Victor, you and 3 others will position yourselves to watch the main entrance. Everyone else will remain here with me while we develop our strategy." Marcus was assigned to stay with the horses, as expected. He watched as the other recruits moved off through the forest with practiced stealth, their excitement barely contained. This was their moment to transition from students to warriors, and they were eager to prove themselves worthy of the royal guard. Left alone with the pack animals, Marcus tried to make himself useful by organizing equipment and ensuring the horses remained calm and quiet. But his attention kept drifting to the lodge, where he could occasionally see figures moving past the windows. Somewhere inside that building, innocent people were being held against their will, depending on rescue from the very soldiers who considered Marcus unworthy of their ranks. The waiting was agony. Minutes stretched into hours as the scouting parties gathered information, and Commander Harrison developed his plan of attack. Marcus could hear occasional whispered reports as the scouts returned with details about the building's layout and the bandits' positions, but he was too far away to understand the specifics. Finally, as the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, Commander Harrison assembled his force for the assault. The plan was straightforward. Elena's team would attack from the rear while Victor's group stormed the front entrance. The remaining recruits would provide support and prevent any bandits from escaping through the windows. "Williams," the commander said as the others prepared for battle, "you will remain here with the horses. Under no circumstances are you to leave this position or attempt to join the fighting. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, trying to hide his disappointment. He watched as his fellow recruits checked their weapons one final time and moved toward their assigned positions. Their faces showed a mixture of nervousness and determination that Marcus envied deeply. The attack began with Elena's signal from the rear of the lodge. Marcus heard shouts and the clash of steel as the recruits burst through doors and windows simultaneously. The bandits, caught completely off guard, responded with desperate ferocity. The sounds of combat echoed through the forest as Marcus remained frozen in his designated position, holding the reins of increasingly agitated horses. Then something went wrong. Marcus heard Elena scream in pain, followed by Victor's angry shout for reinforcements. The carefully planned assault was not going as smoothly as everyone had expected. The bandits were fighting with the desperate courage of cornered animals, and several of the recruits were already wounded. "Fall back! Fall back!" Commander Harrison's voice rang out through the trees. "They have crossbows positioned in the upper windows." Marcus watched in horror as his fellow recruits began retreating from the lodge, several of them supporting wounded comrades. Blood stained their uniforms, and their faces showed the shock of discovering that real combat was nothing like their training exercises. The bandits, emboldened by their success, began pursuing the retreating soldiers. "They're getting away!" Thomas shouted as he stumbled past Marcus's position, a deep cut across his sword arm dripping blood onto the ground. "The hostages are still inside, and we can't get close enough to rescue them." Commander Harrison appeared through the trees, his usually perfect uniform torn and dirty. His left shoulder was wounded, and his face showed the grim realization that his mission was failing. The bandits had proven more organized and better armed than anyone had expected, turning the rescue attempt into a disaster. "We need a new approach," the commander said through gritted teeth. "The main entrances are too well defended, and they have the high ground advantage. If we attack again directly, more of us will be killed, and the hostages might be murdered in retaliation." Marcus listened to the discussion that followed, feeling helpless and useless. The other recruits proposed various alternative strategies, but none seemed likely to succeed. The bandits had clearly prepared for exactly this kind of rescue attempt, and they held all the advantages in terms of position and preparation. As darkness began to fall, the situation grew more desperate. They could hear voices from inside the lodge, suggesting that the bandits were becoming increasingly agitated and unpredictable. Time was running out for the hostages, and the Royal Guard recruits seemed to have run out of viable options. Then Marcus remembered something his grandfather had told him during those long afternoons practicing archery in the forest. The old soldier had spoken about unconventional tactics and the importance of thinking beyond traditional military approaches. Sometimes, he had explained, the most effective solutions came from unexpected directions. Marcus studied the lodge's architecture in the fading light, noting details that the other recruits had overlooked in their focus on direct assault tactics. There was a large oak tree near the building's eastern wall, its branches extending close to the upper-story windows. The tree was positioned in a blind spot where the bandits' crossbow positions could not effectively cover it. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, approaching Commander Harrison, "I might have an idea." The commander looked at him with surprise and irritation. "Williams, I told you to remain with the horses. This is not the time for amateur suggestions." "Please, sir," Marcus persisted. "I think I can get inside through an upstairs window. The bandits won't expect an attack from that direction, and I might be able to create enough confusion to give you a better chance at rescuing the hostages." Thomas laughed bitterly. "The village boy wants to play hero. Commander, sending him in there would be suicide, for him and for the hostages." But Commander Harrison studied Marcus with new attention. The conventional assault had failed, and desperate times called for unconventional measures. Perhaps the weak link in his unit might actually provide an unexpected advantage. "Explain your plan, Williams," the commander said finally. Marcus stood before Commander Harrison and the other recruits, his heart pounding as he outlined his desperate plan. The faces around him showed mixtures of skepticism, concern, and barely concealed contempt. These were the same people who had mocked him for months, and now he was proposing to attempt what their combined training and superior skills had failed to accomplish. "The oak tree on the eastern side extends close enough to the second floor," Marcus explained, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "I can climb up and enter through one of the upper windows. From there, I should be able to position myself to provide cover for another assault attempt." "With what weapon?" Victor asked mockingly. "That pathetic bow of yours? You can barely hit a stationary target at close range, let alone moving enemies in a combat situation." "It's better than no plan at all," Marcus replied quietly. "And it might be our only chance to save the hostages before the bandits decide to kill them." Commander Harrison studied the young recruit with calculating eyes. The boy was right about one thing. They were running out of options, and time was not on their side. The sounds from inside the lodge suggested that the bandits were growing more agitated as darkness fell, which did not bode well for their captives' safety. "The plan has merit," the commander admitted reluctantly. But sending our weakest recruit on what amounts to a suicide mission is hardly a solution. Williams, you lack the skills and experience necessary for this type of operation. Maybe I lack experience, Marcus acknowledged, but I'm also the lightest among us, which makes me the best choice for climbing. And the bandits won't expect an attack from that direction because it seems impossible to anyone thinking conventionally. Elena, despite her wounded arm, joined the discussion. Even if you manage to get inside, what then? You'll be alone against multiple armed enemies in an unfamiliar building. One mistake, and you'll be captured or killed, making the situation even worse. Marcus had considered these objections during the long hours of waiting and planning. His grandfather's military stories had taught him that successful operations often depended more on careful thinking than raw courage. I won't engage them directly, he explained. My goal is to create confusion and provide covering fire while you mount another assault. If I can eliminate even one or two of their lookouts, it might give you the advantage you need. Thomas shook his head in disgust. This is madness. We're actually considering sending the farm boy to do what trained soldiers couldn't accomplish. Commander, surely you can see that this will only make our failure complete. But Commander Harrison had served in enough campaigns to recognize that desperate situations sometimes required unconventional solutions. The traditional military approach had failed, and continuing to repeat the same tactics would likely result in the death of both hostages and more recruits. Perhaps it was time to gamble on an unexpected strategy. Very well, Williams, the commander said finally. You have 1 hour to attempt your infiltration. If you're not successful by then, we'll withdraw and call for reinforcements from the capital. The other recruits stared in shock. They had expected the commander to reject Marcus's proposal immediately, not actually authorize what seemed like a hopeless mission. Marcus himself felt a surge of terror mixed with determination. This was his chance to prove that he belonged among them, but failure would likely mean death. As Marcus prepared for his attempt, the other recruits offered equipment and advice with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Elena gave him a small dagger to supplement his bow, while Victor provided a coil of rope that might prove useful for the descent. Even Thomas, despite his obvious skepticism, helped Marcus blacken his face and hands with mud to reduce visibility in the darkness. Remember, Commander Harrison said as Marcus prepared to leave, your primary objective is to survive long enough to create an opportunity for the rest of us. Don't attempt to be a hero. Just do enough to give us a chance. Marcus nodded silently, understanding that the commander expected him to fail, but hoped his sacrifice might provide some tactical advantage. As he crept through the forest toward the eastern side of the lodge, Marcus felt the weight of everyone's low expectations pressing down on him like a physical burden. The oak tree was ancient and massive, with thick branches that extended well beyond the lodge's walls. Marcus had climbed many such trees during his childhood in the village, but never under such dangerous circumstances. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, and he expected to hear shouts of discovery at any moment. The climb was more difficult than he had anticipated. His equipment made him clumsy, and the branches swayed dangerously under his weight. But his years of farm work had given him strong hands and good balance, advantages that his aristocratic fellow recruits lacked. Slowly and carefully, he made his way up toward the second-floor level. From his position in the tree, Marcus could see into several windows of the lodge. Most of the rooms appeared empty, but he could hear voices and movement from the lower floor where the main confrontation was taking place. He selected a window that seemed to lead to an unused bedroom and carefully worked his way along a thick branch until he could reach the glass. The window was unlocked, probably because no one expected an attack from such an unlikely direction. Marcus slipped inside as quietly as possible, finding himself in a small guest room furnished with simple hunting lodge amenities. His heart pounded so loudly that he was certain the entire building could hear it. Moving to the door, Marcus listened carefully to the sounds coming from elsewhere in the lodge. He could distinguish several different voices, suggesting that there were at least 6 or 7 bandits involved in the operation. They seemed to be concentrated on the ground floor, probably watching the entrances and keeping their hostages under guard. Marcus crept out into the hallway, his bow ready with an arrow nocked but not drawn. The upper floor appeared to be deserted, which made sense since the bandits would want to keep their prisoners and defensive positions on the ground level. But this also meant that Marcus would have to find a way to create his diversion from above. He located a staircase leading down to the main floor and positioned himself at the top where he could observe the scene below. Through the railings, he could see 3 bandits stationed near the front entrance, their crossbows aimed at the doorway. 2 more were visible near what appeared to be the main hall, and he could hear additional voices from other rooms. The hostages were being held in the lodge's great room, tied to chairs and watched by 2 guards. Marcus could see Lord Blackwood's daughter among them, a young woman about his own age whose face showed both fear and defiant anger. The sight of their plight steeled his resolve and reminded him why this mission was so important. Marcus knew he had only one chance to create the diversion that his fellow recruits needed. If he missed his first shot or failed to achieve surprise, the bandits would quickly locate and overwhelm him. Everything he had learned during those long months of training and practice would be put to the ultimate test in the next few moments. He selected his target carefully, one of the crossbow-armed bandits near the front entrance who seemed to be the most alert and dangerous. Marcus drew his bow slowly, remembering his grandfather's lessons about patience and accuracy. The months of mockery and humiliation had taught him to block out distractions and focus completely on his objective. The arrow flew silent and true, striking the bandit in the shoulder and spinning him around with a cry of pain and surprise. Before the others could react, Marcus had already nocked a second arrow and was taking aim at the guard nearest the hostages. This shot also found its mark, dropping the man before he could harm his prisoners. Chaos erupted in the lodge as the remaining bandits shouted warnings and tried to locate their unseen attacker. Marcus had achieved complete surprise, exactly as he had hoped. But now came the most dangerous part of his plan. He had to maintain pressure while avoiding the searching crossbow bolts that were beginning to splinter the wood around his position. Outside, Commander Harrison heard the commotion and immediately ordered his recruits to renew their assault. This time, with several of the defenders wounded or distracted, the Royal Guard trainees were able to breach the entrances and engage the remaining bandits on more equal terms. Marcus continued to provide covering fire from his elevated position, picking off targets with a precision that shocked him as much as it would have amazed his critics. Every arrow seemed to find its intended mark, and his movements were fluid and confident in a way they had never been during training exercises. The real combat situation had awakened something in Marcus that months of practice could never have revealed. Under pressure, with lives depending on his accuracy, he discovered that he possessed natural abilities that had been hidden by self-doubt and the constant criticism of his peers. His grandfather's training had prepared him for this moment better than all the formal military instruction he had received. Within minutes, the battle was over. The surviving bandits had either surrendered or fled into the forest, abandoning their hostages and their planned robbery. The Royal Guard recruits secured the building and began treating the wounded, while Marcus climbed down from his position, still hardly believing what he had accomplished. Commander Harrison examined the scene with obvious amazement. 3 of the bandits had been eliminated by precise archery from an impossible angle, and the tactical situation had been completely reversed by a single individual acting alone. The recruit he had considered the weakest link had just demonstrated combat skills that exceeded those of his most promising students. "Williams," the commander said as Marcus approached, his voice showing a respect that had never been there before. "Your performance tonight has been extraordinary. I owe you an apology for underestimating your capabilities." The other recruits gathered around, their expressions ranging from shock to grudging admiration. Thomas, in particular, seemed unable to comprehend how the farm boy they had mocked for so long had just accomplished what their combined efforts had failed to achieve. "How?" Elena asked simply. "How did you make those shots in the dark under pressure when you could barely hit targets during practice?" Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "I think," he said slowly, "that I shoot better when something important is at stake. During training, I was always worried about looking foolish or disappointing everyone. Tonight I was only thinking about saving the hostages." Lord Blackwood's daughter, now freed from her bonds, approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. "You saved our lives," she said simply. "I don't know how you did it, but you saved us all." As they prepared to return to the capital with their rescued hostages and captured bandits, Commander Harrison took Marcus aside for a private conversation. "Williams, I need to ask you something. Have you had advanced archery training that you didn't mention in your application?" Marcus shook his head. "Only what my grandfather taught me when I was young. He was a soldier once, but he never spoke much about it. I learned to hunt in the forest behind our cottage, but nothing more formal than that." The commander studied him intently. "Your grandfather's name was William as well, wasn't it? William of the northern border?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, surprised that the commander knew his grandfather's full name. "Did you know him?" A strange expression crossed Commander Harrison's weathered face. "William of the northern border was the finest marksman in the Royal Guard's history. He was known as the Ghost Archer because he could eliminate targets from impossible distances without being detected. I served under him during the border wars 20 years ago." Marcus stared in shock. His grandfather had never mentioned being in the Royal Guard, let alone being famous for his archery skills. The old man had always presented himself as just another common soldier who had served his time and retired to farming. "Why didn't he tell me?" Marcus asked. "Because," Commander Harrison replied, "true warriors don't boast about their accomplishments. Your grandfather was humble about his abilities, just as you should be about yours. But Marcus, what you did tonight proves that skill and courage can run in families, even when they skip a generation." The journey back to the capital was unlike anything Marcus had experienced during his months of training. Instead of riding alone at the rear of the column, he found himself surrounded by fellow recruits who wanted to hear about his infiltration and ask questions about his shooting techniques. The mockery and isolation that had defined his training experience were suddenly replaced by respect and genuine curiosity. Thomas, perhaps the most surprised of all, eventually approached Marcus with something resembling humility. "I owe you an apology," he said stiffly. "I was wrong about your abilities and your worthiness to serve in the Royal Guard." "You weren't entirely wrong," Marcus replied honestly. "I did lack experience and confidence, but sometimes people grow into their potential when the situation demands it." When they reached the capital, news of the rescue mission had already spread throughout the military community. Marcus found himself summoned to appear before senior officers who wanted to hear first-hand accounts of the operation. His performance had caught the attention of people far above Commander Harrison's rank. Within a week, Marcus received an unexpected assignment. Instead of continuing with the standard recruit training, he was selected for advanced instruction in reconnaissance and precision shooting. The Royal Guard had recognized that they possessed a potentially valuable asset, one whose unique skills could be developed for specialized missions. But perhaps more importantly, Marcus had discovered something about himself that changed his entire perspective on his place in the world. The farm boy who had been mocked for his humble origins and inadequate training had found his true calling in the service of his kingdom. The sniper of the Royal Guard had been born not through aristocratic privilege or formal military education, but through determination, natural ability, and the wisdom passed down by a grandfather who had walked the same path decades earlier. Years later, when Marcus had become a legendary figure in his own right, young recruits would ask him about the secret to his success. He would always tell them the same thing his grandfather had taught him during those long afternoons in the forest. The greatest weapon is not the bow or the arrow, but the mind that guides them. And the strongest mind belongs to the person who refuses to surrender when everyone else expects them to fail. The boy who had been mocked by all had become the defender that none of them could have imagined, and in proving himself, Marcus had learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from meeting others' expectations, but from discovering the strength that lies hidden within our own hearts.